Okay. Next up, we have Marietje Schaake. She is Stanford Center's Policy Center International Policy Director. She previously served as a member of the European Parliament, and she has a talk for you guys next. So I'd like to bring up Marietje Schaake.
Hello, hello. So I'm sorry if you thought you were going to come to a talk that's called The Health of the Internet, but when I was writing and thinking about what I actually really wanted to tell you, I changed the title to Who Wants to Be a Rebel? And only today I found this flyer, Mozilla and the Rebel Alliance, which it's not really actually intended to address this flyer, but we'll see. This talk is a little bit of tough love, and I hope you can handle it. Because when I come to festivals like this, it's actually my first time at MozFest, but I feel really great already. The same at events like RightsCon or the IGF or other places where a lot of people that believe in the open internet and the rights of people on it come together in such a committed and fun way. But the relief that I have and the sense of hope that I get at events like this always come from experts, policy advocacy people that have the best legal arguments to convince policymakers to turn something in the right direction or come up with fun gifts or campaigns. I leave when I leave from these kinds of events with a sense of relief that there's a lot of people that I agree with and that there's a real fight back to the sort of closing and shutting down of the internet at times, or the trend of actually using it as a plantation to harvest data and profits alike. But during the last 10 years that I was in the European Parliament, I saw civil society organizations, but also others working on digital rights really as my key allies. I liked consulting them along with others before I made decisions. And I was always very happy and also a little bit relieved when I could count on the support of organizations whose goals I hoped to help achieve with the things I was doing in the European Parliament. And so it's from this experience of sort of looking at this ecosystem of civil society and others in the technical community who believe in the open internet and the rights of people on it, that I actually want to share some more concerned thoughts. And my thoughts today are going to be about big words, about spam, and about my mother, or your neighbor. We can see later. Firstly, on big words, this is really something that keeps me up at night. Because I think when we talk about the open internet and digital rights, all the big words have been used. We've seen a Magna Carta for the internet, bills of rights that are being drafted in many places, and a number of them have been adopted in multi-stakeholder gatherings like this one, not so much by parliaments, and I think that that's interesting. There have been social compact declarations of independence, and there are now already more than 120 ethical guidelines in Europe alone when it comes to dealing with artificial intelligence. However, even though all these big words are being used, the internet is still being chopped up. It's sovereignized. I don't know if that's a word, but I hope you know what I mean. And human rights in general, but digital rights in particular, are under enormous pressure. We may still speak of the open internet, but frankly, it is more and more with nostalgia, and surveillance from commercial and political control goals is actually becoming more and more of a norm. So I truly think we need to ask ourselves what went wrong. Because while those of us who believe in the open society and the open internet alike face the biggest challenges, all the big words have already been used. And while these words are anchored in concepts of law and democracy, they have not rendered laws that were adopted in parliaments or regulations, for example. And I would even dare to put the challenge before, and I hope somebody's willing to research it, to put the challenge before you, whether more than 1% of CEOs and political decision makers are aware of the existence of all these beautiful and rights-based declarations at all. The various bills of rights, social compacts for the web, etc., etc. And I hate to say that, but I think it's not good enough that we are in the situation where we are. So, 2, about spam, and maybe also big words, actually. Many rebels, digital rights organizations, will lobby or organize campaigns around topics on the political agenda. They will often mobilize thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. And I've experienced from the receiving end, let's say, that even though my position was well known, for example, against the copyright directive that was adopted in the EU before the summer, still I would be included in the list of politicians who were sort of free for all to start spamming and targeting with emails, spam, or social media messages. And I mean, I'm not talking about an email with concerns, but really, you know, automated every couple of seconds, sort of flooding the inbox, which really made it impossible to do my work. And that was not only for me, but also for my colleagues. And what that suggested was really that it didn't quite matter what position I took. I would be showered with advocacy to the contrary either way. And I think that we see more and more that politicians as such, sort of in bulk, are made the target of criticism. And sometimes even the EU was being blamed for nothing less than destroying the internet. We're looking here at a slide of an organization that I love, Bits of Freedom, which says the European institutions agree the internet must be broken. And it's integrally copy-pasted by a very populist blog called Geen Stijl for the Dutch speakers among us, which basically says Brussels agrees the internet must be broken. And here you see something similar. It's not about copyright. The EU is trying to destroy the internet. Now, not only do I think that this rhetoric plays into the hands of broader populist waves against the European Union, while many others place big hope in the EU as a super regulator, as a principled and values-based place that can also translate to the internet. But it also gave, I would say, colleagues who are not as committed to tech topics an impression that basically there is no solution, that everything is doomed and things can only get worse. So it's I think, not really an invitation to engage in a conversation. It also really implies that any regulatory proposal on the table is very heavily scrutinized, while the status quo just, continues without intervention. And I think status quo also needs equal scrutiny as new legislative proposals. Now, another observation about how sometimes the whole dynamic between lawmakers and civil society organizations plays out, and this is broader, not just digital rights organizations, but there's a lot of organizations that have strong ideals that will only be satisfied when 100% of these ideals are reflected in final legislative outcomes, for example. But realistically, that is never going to happen in a democratic process. There's a need to compromise, to get anything done. And this is not my favorite part of lawmaking, but it is a very normal and predictable element of democracy. Now, other trends I've seen is basically organizations not taking a position, even though advocacy could have been helpful, waiting for the negotiated result, and then using the time that, for example, in the EU is going to be used for translating, to then start lobbying for the outcome that was already achieved. And then victory. If it wasn't for us, this would have never happened, although I think that can be debated. So the question is really looking at this landscape, and just put yourselves in the shoes of someone who's not at MozFest, a politician that you have to convince. Why would an individual whose political group, for example, is wholesale being targeted as evil in its entirety, be invited to meet and to listen and to engage? I think that for those people, there's not really an upside in doing so, even though, and we learn these painful lessons over and over again, sometimes a few votes can really make a difference. In the copyright directive, we saw that as well. So being able to reach people that you don't agree with and have them open the door to you really matters. Let me see, I'm not so good with slides. Oh, here was another example of Europe delays a plan to destroy the internet. Okay, well, I guess that was good. So my last observation is about my mom or my neighbor. I think if you want to make sure that there are digital rights and that the open internet has a chance, the person you want to convince is actually my mom. And when my mom sees this, or this, or this, she will not have the impression that those people are talking about something that matters to her. She may think it's a demonstration for something completely different, even though I would say it would be good if she thinks that this is about her. My mom is not a rebel. I believe the majority of people do not identify as rebels. I don't identify as a rebel. But I really believe that we need to preserve standards of openness, digital rights, the open internet if we can, the rule of law online, etc. So I know that stickers are really cool here for laptops. I understand, but I think that there's others who see it as maybe like high schoolish or a sign of sort of squatters and immaturity maybe even, like why would you want to do that? I think it's a subculture that is not always broadly understood. And I'm a liberal, so I'm always very hesitant to say anything about appearances, and I think anyone should feel free and be free to show up whichever way they want. But it's also good to be realistic about what it signals and how what you send out could be perceived by the audience. So it's more about trying to understand what people may see when they see these kinds of images. So that was kind of the tough. Now comes the love. Because the only reason why I'm actually sharing these observations is because I believe a lot more can be accomplished, and I really, really, really wish for that to happen. And for that to happen, I think a strategic agenda is very, very important. So I encourage you all, as a very broad and diverse community, to move from a more niche position to a constructive center position, and to switch from a more declaratory approach to a very strategic approach. It's not only urgent to have more impact, but it also is important that you can still have your own position in this debate while more and more organizations are moving into the space of digital, because everything becomes digital. So to look at how you can reach that broader conversation from, let's say, a very specialist, very specific position in the political and public debate is probably something to think about. I think there is more and more competition coming from, let's say, more established NGOs and other organizations as well. So I think it's important to work with other organizations, of course, to do mutually beneficial exchanges of knowledge. But instead of having more declarations or every organization wanting to launch its own set of principles and declarations, to work together more, to have a longer-term strategic approach. And I hope it can be done without depending on money from the very tech companies that have to be challenged in a lot of the negative effects that we see in the whole digital ecosystem that are actually responsible, I believe, for significant parts of the harms that we are now dealing with. But as I mentioned before, a strategic approach will also mean compromise at times and an articulation of a landing zone which falls outside of the 100% perfect. It means being more sophisticated than attacking the EU or politics, but rather to work with individuals that you can actually achieve or engage, to embrace who's doing something well, and to, of course, criticize what's not going well, but I would encourage in a way that still allows both sides to bridge and find each other, not to get into trenches that are, impossible to overcome, to listen and not to push people too much into the defensive. I'm also hoping, this is also a tricky point to make, I realize, but that we will see an end to the glee of how little politicians actually know about technology. I've seen a lot of places, and I understand why it can be funny sometimes, because there are some crazy expressions when it comes to technology and the internet sometimes, but it is really not something to be happy about. It is much better to create a space that people can come to understand it better, where they feel safe to ask stupid questions, instead of sort of feeling like they may be laughed at in their faces. And I think the opposite is also true, is that a lot of people who are very good at technology do not automatically know everything about the democratic and policy process. So there's mutual learning that I think can be very, very beneficial. So if the goal is to get things done, to see changes and to see results, it's important to grow the pool of people who believe in digital rights, open standards, good governance in tech policies and whatnot. It's important to make them feel at home, to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel welcome. and to be open to them, to work with people across various political opinions, because more and more we will see political fragmentation, as we see in Europe, but in many places all over the world. And so that really means that new, more creative coalitions will have to be built. Slimmer majorities will also often mean that every vote counts. And so in an ideal world, I would like to see more politicians at events like this, walking in the door and understanding this is a space where I can be, where I can participate in the debate, where I can ask the questions that I have, and where I can find people that welcome me. So if that means, and this is a metaphor of course, but showing up without stickers on a laptop in a parliament, I think it's worth it. Now, I understand why people would think, are you crazy? Why would you give a talk like this to the people who are fighting hardest under difficult circumstances for digital rights, open standards, and good tech policies? Especially at a festival that brings together many of its leaders that actually share the goals that you have. I totally understand why people think that that's crazy, and indeed, it is more comfortable to all agree, to drink, to dance, to find friends, to hang out, and to go home feeling hopeful. It's easier to do that than to critically look at all of us and to evaluate where we are today, despite all the hard work that's been done, and to reignite a new sense of urgency, to strategize, to reach people outside of your own friendship and comfort zones, because I really believe it is needed. Thank you.
That was great. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick audience Q&A. Any questions? Oh, right there.
So, thanks. Hi, my name is Doman. I'm coming from Slovenia. I'm one of those people who were shouting they're destroying our internet from 2012, 13, when ACTA treaty was on the chopping board. My question to you would be: this is all great, but there's a whole industry and bought-out politicians on the other side saying, for example, in the copyright directive fight that, you know, all activists are paid by Google. We don't have a things to say, just copying what Google is saying. Mm-hmm. So how do you fight against that? This is all great for, let's say, if we make a 10-year plan, but in 10 years there's going to be at least 2 to 3, maybe 4 issues like the copyright directive and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
on the block, and they will use the same argument every time, while we are supposed to be the nice guys who play with and share and stuff.
Yeah, I understand your concern. I mean, I think a couple of observations. So I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I'm going to pretend that I, am not interested in this discussion. I'm going to say, oh, I've heard you saying the internet was going to be destroyed in 2012, and guess what? It's still here. People can very much dismiss very big concerns if they haven't seen it. So that's just one. It's something I've also heard. Oh gosh, we've heard this before. Internet's not going to go away, please. The other thing is to try to see who you can reach before the whole sort of shouting matches and escalations are happening. Because in the copyright directive, I had a very strong position, but I can assure you it was not pretty on all sides. Things were said back and forth, things were done back and forth, let's say if you divided roughly into camps, that I think are not really where we want to go. And it also wears out, I believe. If you get to sort of the strongest arguments, also on the other side, dismissing criticism as fake news, as being bought by Google as well. I mean, everybody seemed to be bought by someone in this debate, even though that too is not true. People may just disagree even if they're not bought. So I would say I fully agree there's going to be major files coming up, probably the e-commerce directive, digital services, other stuff on very important areas for everyone. Try to engage in sort of ongoing relations and try to already establish relations with new members of the Commission, new members of the European Parliament, hopefully before things are becoming a shouting match where nobody wants to come out of the trenches anymore. I mean, I've spoken to colleagues who said, I think I may have made a mistake on the copyright directive, but it was so harsh, I couldn't come back. And I'm serious. So you have to find a landing zone that's not the perfect, but where you can still bring people that are willing to move. If a handful of people would have moved on the copyright directive, we would not have had such a terrible law right now. So I think there's lessons for everybody, and that's what I'm trying to show you. Not to say to stop your hard work, but to sort of give the perspective of how it can be perceived, not by people that are like-minded, but by people that you have to convince. That's what I was trying to do. Yeah.
Another question back there.
Hi. Sorry, I came in a little bit later, so maybe you've talked about this before. In terms of destroying the internet will always go on no matter what the copyright laws or the freedom in the internet you're able to do. The internet from the 90s was so much freer than what we see today. Yet the internet hasn't, been killed. It's just been taken over by monopolies. So how can, we tackle this monopolization of the internet? Because I don't believe it could be free while the monopoly is taking place.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point. I think privatization of almost everything digital, especially in the hands of a few gatekeepers or those that I mentioned, treat the internet as a plantation where they can just harvest data and profits in a complete asymmetrical power position. So questions of antitrust, are there monopolies? Questions of how do we value not only monetary power of companies, but also the data that they hold when it comes to mergers and acquisitions? How do we apply the general data protection regulation to questions like micro-targeting? Not only for political ads, but maybe for different sensitive categories that could be in conflict with anti-discrimination principles or whatnot. So I think that in the EU, and that's the good news, there's a lot of anchors, hooks, points to start a conversation and to see what can be done. I think the momentum is there. But at the same time that the momentum and the urgency is there, the fragmentation of politics is greater. It will make it harder and also just more timely to get to decisions because there will be people who will try to obstruct decisions and procedures will be used or abused no matter, depending on which side you come from, to obstruct and to delay. So urgency is huge. I would indeed try to look at those topics that are opportune for European action, but I wish it was easier than I think it will be. I think it will be tough. Yeah.
We have one more question we can do.
Yeah, let's do the front row.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Lena from Croatia. Thank you for everything you did for European democracy. I was sitting in Brussels when we had this gathering of people having stickers on the laptops talking to you. And you did amazing Copify. Thank you very much. So I'm thinking about integration and onboarding of digital rights activists in that particular space, because I think that what you're observing, you saw a European perspective, but you're also having, let's say, privilege coming from Netherlands, the first country that embraced net neutrality, the country that has such an amazing digital rights scene, bits of freedom.
Yeah.
I am kind of from small country, Croatia, and we don't have digital rights activists. I think I was actually the only one, and that's not very good because I'm in my 40s. My old digital literacy is quite questionable, and talking to MEPs in German
I'm also
and
in my
French.
40s. It's
yeah, I know it's not easy for us, but sometimes you find those. You find your own challenges to integrate in something that you believe in, because we are coming from different backgrounds and different cultures and different age. But also, I was observing for the first time in copyright, I thought that there was, that's my question, possible alliance between SMEs, startups, and I thought that finally we are tapping into some resources because we don't have it as a digital rights scene. We barely have a scene, and it takes a lot of resources to actually do what you're saying now, because we need structures. We need somebody like you to tell us how to lobby, what to do, but how to go about that practically. Can we tap in something that is more already existing? Kind of how to, because usually who is creating those alliances is it's on a broader national or EU level, so it's supposed to be you kind of creating, because private entities cannot create those alliances. So how do we go better about waving the network of support and resources that is required to continue on? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that question. And I didn't want to imply that anything is easy. I mean, I know how hard it is and how, from a position of being the underdog. I didn't become a lobbyist after politics on purpose, so I don't want to do that. But I think if I were a civil society organization in the digital rights space or in the open standards space, I would really mention much more that there's too much corporate funding going to civil society and knock on the doors of more independent foundations and where possible incredible governments to say, look guys, this is what's happening. You know, because one of the other arguments against those who were critical of the copyright directive was that they're all being bought by the tech companies. Well, it's a mixed picture, unfortunately, actually. But I would say what you already mentioned, that there were multiple organizations, SMEs, it's always a hugely solid and big group of representatives. So if you can be in a coalition with others than digital rights activists, have a larger group of people, it's always more powerful to speak in any debate on behalf of more people. That's just how it works. You were expressing how challenging it was to be basically like the lone fighter. If you have 100,000 people, 200,000, 5 million companies, etc. behind you, it just makes your message louder, even if you say the same. How is to work together on the European level, but still tapping into what's important nationally, but really trying to also pool resources there, and to build coalitions. It's a permanent effort, but I would say consumer rights organizations are natural allies as well, who are also increasingly understanding that everything is digital, so that there's a lot to be done in consumer rights and tech. So there's not one formula for coalitions, but it's a process. It's also typically Dutch, I have to say. We now have a 4-party coalition, but to work together, and I think it's usually a very good thing to do. And the more you can make that coalition be centrist and representing many, the more powerful I think the message will be towards the people who have to make a decision. It's harder to simply say it doesn't matter if you speak on behalf of such a big group. Yeah.
All right, big round of applause for Marietje Schaake. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.